The room was a definition of intimidation. The masterclass hall at the Vienna Conservatory of Music. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, and a 9-foot Steinway grand piano sat in the center. At the front of the room stood Madame Elise Dubois, a vocal coach legendary for her work with icons like Celine Dion and Andrea Bocelli. She was known as a scalpel because she could dissect a singer's confidence with a single word. On the whiteboard, she had drawn a musical scale, circling a note at the very top, a high F-sharp F6. "This," she declared to the room of elite international students, "is the ceiling of human ability. Even Celine struggles to sustain this with full vibrato. Do not attempt it, or you will shred your vocal cords." The students nodded in fear. But in the back row, a quiet Filipino student named Mateo, wearing a faded hoodie, raised his hand. He didn't just want to attempt it. He was infused because he hit that note every morning in the shower. Madame Dubois was a purist. To her, singing was a discipline of restraint, posture, and classical technique. She despised the modern style of belting or screaming, which she often associated with amateur singers found on YouTube. She had a particular prejudice against what she called mimics, singers from Asia who she believed merely copied Western divas without understanding the technique. She believed that true power came from years of expensive conservatory training, not from singing in karaoke bars. She had spent the last hour humiliating students, pointing out their breast support issues and nasal tones. She was building a narrative that greatness was an exclusive club, and she was a bouncer. She wanted to prove that raw talent was a myth and that only her method worked. Mateo was the anomaly in the room. He was a scholarship student from a small province in the Philippines. He hadn't grown up with piano lessons or solfege training. He grew up with a Magic Sing microphone plugged into a CRT TV in his neighbor's garage. His training consisted of joining amateur singing contests, barangay fiestas, where he had to sing songs by Whitney Houston, Mariah Carey, and Regine Velasquez to win a sack of rice or 500 pesos. In the Philippines, hitting high notes isn't a special skill, it's a requirement. If you can't belt a G5, you don't win. Mateo was technically untrained, but his vocal cords were forged in the fire of high-stakes competition. He felt out of place among the rich kids in Vienna, but he knew his instrument. When Mateo raised his hand, the room went silent. The other students turned to look at him with a mix of pity and embarrassment. Madame Dubois peered over her spectacles. "Yes? The boy in the back. Do you have a question? Or do you need the bathroom?" she asked, eliciting snickers from the front row. Mateo stood up, clutching his backpack straps nervously. He said, his voice soft and accented. "You said the F6 is impossible to sustain with vibrato. But in my country, we sing that note a lot. I think it is possible." The audacity of a statement sucked the air out of the room. A nobody challenging the authority of Celine Dion's coach? It was social suicide. Madame Dubois laughed. It was a cold, dry sound. "In your country? Oh, you mean the karaoke singing." She stepped away from the piano and walked toward him, heels clicking on the hardwood floor. "Listen to me, young man. There's a difference between squeaking a note like a mouse and singing a note with operatic resonance. What you hear on your little machines is falsetto. It is thin. It is weak. I am talking about full-head voice mix with chest resonance. It requires a glottal compression that most men simply cannot physically achieve. But please, if you think you know better than 30 years of pedagogy, come to the front." She gestured to the stage, essentially inviting him to his own execution. Mateo walked down the aisle. He could feel the judgment burning into his skin. He heard whispers of his going to crack, and this is going to be painful. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing sneakers. He looked small next to the grand piano. Madame Dubois sat at the bench, her posture rigid. "I will play the scale," she said dismissively. "We will start at C4 and go up. Stop when it hurts. I don't want to be sued for vocal damage." She didn't ask for his name. To her, he was just a lesson to be taught to the class. This is what happens when you don't respect the technique. She struck the first chord. Mateo opened his mouth. The first few notes were standard, a warm, clear tenor. Nothing special, but in tune. Madame Dubois looked bored. She sped up the tempo, moving quickly through the passaggio, the break between chest and head voice, hoping to catch him off guard. Usually, untrained singers crack here, but Mateo navigated the bridge effortlessly. In the Philippines, mixing is second nature because most power ballads require it. He kept his larynx neutral, his sound placement forward. He wasn't straining. As they passed the high C, the tenor C, the class started to pay attention. That is usually the limit for most men. Mateo hit it with a smile, as if he were just warming up. Madame Du Bois raised an eyebrow. "Not bad," she muttered, "but we are entering the stratosphere now." She moved to the E5, then the G5. These are notes that usually require women to switch to head voice and men to switch to falsetto. Mateo did something that shocked the classical students. He kept the chestiness in the sound. He was using a technique called belting, but he was doing it with a healthy mix. It sounded powerful, thick, and resonant. It didn't sound like a choir boy. It sounded like a rock star. The volume in the room increased. The vibration of his voice was starting to rattle the snare drum in the corner. Higher. Madame Du Bois challenged, her competitive spirit ignited. She slammed the keys for a high D6. This is a whistle register territory for many, or at least a very thin head voice. Mateo closed his eyes. He visualized the contest back home, the cheering crowds, the need to be louder than the bad sound system. He shifted his placement. He didn't switch to a weak falsetto. He accessed his super head voice. The note came out laser beam bright. It was clean. It was piercing. The students in the front row actually leaned back. Madame Du Bois stopped playing for a second, looking at his throat, trying to understand the mechanics of what he was doing. "You are straining," she accused, trying to find a flaw. "You cannot sustain that. It is all tension. Do the F6, the impossible note, and hold it for 4 bars, with vibrato." This was a trap. Hitting a note is one thing. Sustaining it is where the breath support fails. If he was muscling it with his throat, he would choke. Mateo took a deep breath, not a shallow chest breath, but a deep, diaphragmatic expansion that made his stomach expand. He grounded his feet. He wasn't thinking about Celine Dion. He was thinking about Morissette Morn. He was thinking about the Beirut Queens. Madame Du Bois hit the F6 key. Plink. The sound hung in the air. Mateo opened his mouth. He didn't slide into the note. He attacked it directly. Ah! The sound was ungodly. It wasn't a squeak. It was a full, resonant, bell-like tone that filled the entire hall. It was loud, shockingly loud. He held it. 1 bar, 2 bars. The tone didn't waver. It didn't crack. Then, he did the unthinkable. He added vibrato, a slow, controlled oscillation of the pitch that proved he was completely relaxed. His neck veins weren't popping. He looked like he was ordering coffee. The class gasped. Literally gasped. Students stood up to see better. Madame Du Bois's hands hovered over the keys, frozen. She had said it was impossible to sustain with vibrato. She was watching physics be defied in front of her eyes. But Mateo wasn't done. In the Philippines, we don't just hit the note, we play with it. As he held the F6, he decided to do a run, a rapid series of notes cascading down the scale, and then shooting back up to the F6 again. It's a signature move of Filipino divas, a display of ultimate agility. He did a pentatonic run, 30-second notes, lightning fast, tumbling down the octaves, and then, whoosh, right back up to the F6, holding it for another 3 seconds before ending with a perfect, soft release. The silence that followed was heavy. It was the silence of a paradigm shifting. Mateo opened his eyes, blinked, and looked at the coach. "Like that?" He asked innocently. He wasn't being arrogant. He genuinely wanted to know if he had passed a test. He adjusted his hoodie, looking a bit shy again. The monster that had just come out of his throat was gone, replaced by the polite student. Madame Du Bois stared at him for a long, uncomfortable moment. Her face went through a journey of emotions: shock, denial, confusion, and finally, awe. She looked at the whiteboard where she had circled the note. She looked at her hands. She had spent 40 years studying the voice, believing she knew the limits of the human instrument. She realized in that moment that her definition of impossible was based on a Western standard that didn't account for the sheer athleticism of Southeast Asian vocalists. She cleared her throat, but her voice cracked, an irony that wasn't lost on the students. Who "Who taught you that?" she whispered. She expected him to name a famous conservatory or a renowned professor. Matteo scratched the back of his head. YouTube. And my tita, auntie. She sings at weddings. She told me to imagine the sound coming out of the top of my head, like a dolphin. A few students giggled, but Madame Dubois didn't laugh this time. A dolphin, she repeated, stunned. The technique he described was actually a simplified visualization of placement, a concept that takes years to teach in university. He had intuitively mastered it through metaphor and mimicry. That was not classical, she stammered, trying to regain her composure. But it was flawless. The admission hit the room like a bomb. The woman who never complimented anyone, who critiqued Celine Dion, had just called a Filipino student flawless. The placement was perfect. The compression was healthy. You have a vocal agility I have not seen since Whitney. She closed the piano lid. Class dismissed. Except you, she pointed at Matteo. We need to talk. The other students erupted into applause. It wasn't polite applause. It was cheering. They rushed Matteo, patting him on the back. How did you do that? Can you teach me? Matteo was overwhelmed. He wasn't used to being the star. He was used to being the background singer. But he had just proven a point that every Filipino knows. We don't need expensive schools to be world-class. We just need a microphone and a reason to sing. The karaoke singer had just schooled a conservatory. The video of the class, secretly recorded by a student on a phone under the desk, was uploaded to TikTok that night. The caption read, "Filipino student destroys Celine Dion's coach." It went viral in hours. Millions of views. The comment section was a sea of Philippine flags. Filipino Pinoy power. Don't underestimate the karaoke kings. That's just a warm-up for us. The video was shared by famous vocal coaches on YouTube, who broke down the technique, analyzing the mix and the whistle with scientific awe. They called him a vocal prodigy. But the real story isn't just about the note. It's about the culture that created the note. In the Philippines, singing is not a hobby. It is a coping mechanism. It is how people deal with poverty, typhoons, and hardship. When you have nothing, you sing. And when you sing for survival, you develop a power that cannot be taught in a classroom. Madame Dubois didn't understand this context. She thought singing was about aesthetics. For Matteo, singing was about expression. His high note wasn't just a frequency, it was a scream of existence. Madame Dubois later interviewed Matteo for a music journal. She asked him, "Did you practice that note for years?" Matteo laughed. "No, I usually sing higher than that when I'm imitating Mariah Carey. The F6 is comfortable. It's a G number 6 that is hard." Madame Dubois nearly fainted. She realized that there was an entire world of vocal capability in the Philippines that the Western classical world had completely ignored because they looked down on pop and mimicry. She realized that mimicry, when done at that level, is actually a form of high-level training and muscle coordination. The effortless nature of the feat is what baffled the experts. Usually, to hit an F6, an opera singer prepares for minutes, aligning their body, making faces. Matteo did it while standing casually in sneakers, without a warm-up. This is a Birit culture. In the Philippines, you are expected to wake up at 6 a.m. and belt Listen by Beyoncé while cooking garlic rice. The vocal cords are conditioned like the muscles of a marathon runner. They are always ready. The lack of pretense is what makes Filipino singers so dangerous in competitions. Matteo's life changed after that masterclass. He didn't drop out, he became the star pupil. But more importantly, he changed the culture of the conservatory. Madame Dubois started studying Philippine vocal techniques. She started accepting more students from Southeast Asia, realizing that they brought a chest-heavy mix that was missing in European singing. She stopped mocking karaoke. She even bought a karaoke machine for her office, joking that it was essential training equipment. The viral fame brought attention to the magic sing culture. People realized that the Philippines is essentially a training camp for vocalists. Every birthday party is a recital. Every funeral is a concert. The sheer volume of hours sung by an average Filipino by the age of 18 dwarfs the practice hours of a conservatory student. It is a 10,000-hour rule in action, disguised as fun. Matteo was just the tip of the iceberg. Celine Dion herself allegedly saw the clip. While this part is rumored, it is said she sent a note to the conservatory. Not to Madame Du Bois, but to Matteo. It simply read, "I wish I could do that run. Keep singing." Whether true or not, the legend of Matteo became folklore in the music school. He became the Dragon of Vienna, the unassuming boy who breathed fire. This story illustrates the danger of gatekeeping. Madame Du Bois believed she owned the keys to excellence. She believed that unless you followed her specific path, classical training, European languages, rigid posture, you were inferior. Matteo proved that there are many paths up the mountain. He climbed the mountain in flip-flops while she was using expensive hiking gear, and he beat her to the summit. It humbled the institution. It also highlights the colonial mentality reversed. For years, Filipinos were told that Western things were better. Western music, Western technique, Western validation. Matteo flipped the script. He used Western songs, yes, but he sang them with a Filipino soul and a Filipino technique, and the Western expert had to bow down to it. It was a moment of reclaiming power. He didn't need to sound classical to be respected. He forced them to respect his sound. The note became a symbol. It wasn't just an F6. It was a sound of breaking barriers. It was a sound of every Filipino who has been told they are just a domestic helper, or just a nurse, or just a labor. When Matteo hit that note, he was saying, "We are more than what you think we are. We are excellence disguised as service." It resonated deeply with the diaspora. Matteo eventually graduated and became a vocal coach himself. He didn't teach strict classical opera. He developed a method called the hybrid, blending European health and safety with Filipino power and agility. His students are now winning competitions all over the world. He always starts his first class with the same sentence. There is no impossible note. There is only a note you haven't figured out how to place yet. So, the next time you hear someone singing karaoke in a garage in Manila, or humming loudly while cleaning a hospital room in London, or belting in a shower, do not laugh. Do not dismiss it as noise. You might be listening to a vocal athlete who can do things that would make a Juilliard professor cry. You might be listening to the next Matteo. The world learned a lesson that day in Vienna. Talent is universal, but the Filipino throat is a special kind of instrument. It is built on joy, resilience, and a refusal to be quiet. Madame Du Bois said no one could hit the note. A Filipino student did it effortlessly, and he did it with a smile, proving that the best revenge against arrogance is simply to be undeniable.